It was a track inspired by a milestone science fiction movie, but passed on by the most prolific producer in music history. How a song about a fictitious astronaut overcame the label of being a novelty song to becoming a transcendent masterpiece by a genius of rock. Next on Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. If you adore music, especially the greatest songs of the rock era, you're gonna love this channel. Subscribe below right now and become a producer with us as well. Check out our Patreon link below. Now, Stanley Kubrick's 1968 motion picture, 2001: A Space Odyssey, it permanently altered the course of sci-fi cinema. The movie was revelatory for its filmmaking, its groundbreaking special effects, and a spectacular depiction of human spaceflight. Kubrick's acclaimed direction and the legendary storytelling of writer Arthur C. Clarke made 2001: A Space Odyssey the film most responsible for boosting literary science fiction into the mainstream. "2001: A Space Odyssey" captured the imagination of moviegoers around the world, and it fascinated a budding rock icon who changed his name from David Jones to David Bowie. David Bowie loved sci-fi movies and novelists. He had a great enthusiasm for American pop culture. He found 2001: A Space Odyssey exhilarating, watching the movie several times during his first run in theaters in 1968. The movie was an awakening for Bowie that inspired a steady flow of ideas for a song that he was constructing at that time. Now, David had just broken up with his actress, model, girlfriend, Hermione Farthingale. It left him shaken with confusion and sadness, which, as we know for an artist, it's the perfect recipe for greatness. It was a period where he fell into the sea of heartbreak and loneliness that many of us have floundered in. The concept of space travel and floating above terrestrial struggles was very appealing to David's psyche at that time. Bowie began writing Space Oddity, centered around a fictional astronaut that he named Major Tom.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Major Tom in outer space became a metaphor about isolation. Now, there is no official comment from David Bowie about why he chose Major Tom as the astronaut's name, but there is a very credible theory. As a young lad growing up in the greater London area of Bromley, England, David saw posters of music hall performer Tom Major, who is the father of Prime Minister John Major. Regardless of the source, Major Tom became a running character in future Bowie compositions. I mean, there's Ashes to Ashes.
We know Major Tom's a junkie, strung out.
Hello, Space Boy.
Space boy, you're sleeping out.
And his music video, Black Star.
And bravely cry, I'm a black star.
Major Tom was also the mythical hero of German musician Peter Schilling in his 1982 cult new wave hit, Major Tom Coming Home. After Bowie wrote the lyrics for Space Oddity, he teamed up with his friend Hutch Hutchinson to record a demo of the song on cassette in 1968. Now, the original demo version was a duet with Bowie singing the Major Tom parts, and Hutch was singing the ground control part.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Later versions, of course, featured Bowie performing all the vocals, since unlike a cassette player, the recording studio could use a multi-track to layer all of the vocal tracks.
Commencing countdown, engines on.
Now, in early 1969, Kenneth Pitt, who managed Bowie at the time, played an audition tape to record labels around London and successfully negotiated a one-album deal with Mercury with options for future records on that label. The executives from Mercury heard a tape that included the rough draft version of Space Oddity recorded by Bowie and Hutchinson. The new deal was predicated on recording a studio version of Space Oddity. Bowie's next move was, of course, to find a producer. So he and his manager presented the Space Oddity demo to perhaps the most prolific producer of the rock era. Probably not even perhaps, Sir George Martin. Amazingly, George Martin passed. Then Bowie turned up to his friend Tony Visconti, who liked every track on the demo except Space Oddity. He too declined the offer to produce that track. In the late 60s, Visconti was a self-proclaimed idealistic American hippie who took a lot of LSD. Space Oddity, for some reason, rubbed Visconti the wrong way. Visconti thought the song sounded like the Beatles, and the sitting in a tin can part of the song was derivative of Simon and Garfunkel's Old Friends from their Bookends LP, a record that Bowie was enamored with.
Here am I sitting in a tin can.
The old friends.
Visconti also felt that Space Oddity was a bad choice for a lead single off of Bowie's self-titled debut on Mercury Records. To Visconti, Space Oddity was a novelty record. It didn't reflect the artistic depth of David Bowie, he felt. He called the song a cheap shot at the forthcoming Apollo 11 space mission, America's plan to put a man on the moon. Very interesting. David Bowie was not at all offended by Visconti's criticism and was actually willing to drop the song altogether. But the label is the one that stipulated that Space Oddity was mandatory or they wouldn't finance the album. I mean, usually it's the label that's against the song that's coming out of left field, but they wanted it nonetheless. Visconti recommended that David Bowie offer the producer gig to his respected friend Gus Dudgeon. Dudgeon had a completely different opinion of Space Oddity. Gus thought the track was incredible, and he couldn't believe that Visconti declined to produce the record. He was more than happy to oblige. So Dudgeon imagined a much grander production for Space Oddity. He enlisted emerging arranger Paul Buckmaster to make it happen. And wow! Man, did Buckmaster ever rise to that occasion. The Grammy Award-winning Buckmaster created a spectacular arrangement that made Space Oddity a just breathtaking, dramatic mini-drama.
This is ground control.
Buckmaster's arrangement, it brilliantly portrayed the imagery of space, where there are no boundaries between the Earth and endlessness. Incredibly, the revamped Space Oddity arrangement evoked a euphoric rush as one imagines how it would feel to be in a spacecraft, defying gravity and the density of the atmosphere gradually decreasing as the vessel rises in altitude. You really do feel that. Certainly a highlight in the vivid instrumentation of Space Oddity is how Buckmaster effectively invented an effect in the song's bridge that simulated the sound of the liftoff of a rocket. I mean, the full spectrum production that you hear on Space Oddity, it's just sadly a lost art today. In addition to Buckmaster and Dudgeon's innovative collaboration, there are two other production components that complete the supernatural soundtrack of Space Oddity. The dominant string orchestration that we hear on the track actually comes from a mellotron that was played by the great Rick Wakeman. Before the world was aware of his genius as a cornerstone to the pioneer musicianship of the band Yes. Tony Visconti performed the fluttering of a flute and other woodwinds on the track with the highly sought-after session musician Herbie Flowers on bass. There's also Terry Cox playing the stoic drum line.
Commencing countdown, engines on.
Perhaps the most magical ingredient of Space Oddity is a quirky miniature analog keyboard that's played by David Bowie called the stylophone. The stylophone was created and patented in 1967 by inventor Brian Jarvis. On Space Oddity, the stylophone sounds like a baritone sax, along with many other interesting simulations. David Bowie adroitly manipulated the stylophone to conjure a science fiction ambiance throughout the track. And the section with the stylophone and Mike Wayne's guitar sequences neatly. It generates a thrilling transition to end the song's bridge. The impactful imagery of Space Oddity is climactic at the track's conclusion. with the layering of Wayne's electric guitar and Bowie's stylophone navigation, creating the illusion of the imaginary spacecraft is flying towards a beautiful nebula during the song's fade out. Space Oddity's riveting arrangement is the score for a haunting, isolated, classic David Bowie vocal. For most of the world back in 1968 to 1969, it was their introduction to the prolific rock chameleon who would reinvent himself and design alter ego characters throughout his career. Bowie pilots a mysterious, eerie journey from the outset of Space Oddity, beginning with the repeat of the song's serious opening transmission. Ground control to Major Tom. I love it. Ground control to Major Tom. Take your protein pills and put your helmet on.
Take your protein pills and put your helmet on.
Has there ever been a more haunting first line in a song than this one? Not many compare to the timeless genius of Bowie. Then the heart-fluttering countdown to liftoff begins.
6, commencing countdown, engines on.
Check ignition, and may God's love be with you.
Check ignition, and may God's love be with you.
It's a pure, unaltered vocal performance by Bowie that leads us through an immersive experience into the aching allure of the unknown.
This is ground control to Major Tom.
The original Stark version of Space Oddity was released as a single in 1968. It did not chart, but it scored David Bowie his record deal with Mercury.
Just want to know whose shirts you wear.
Now, the second coming of Space Oddity, produced by Gus Dudgeon and arranged by the great Paul Buckmaster, both incredible. It was unleashed during the height of a worldwide obsession with space travel. I mean, this was back in that time, with the new and improved single dropping just 5 days before the launching of the U.S. Apollo 11 on July 16, 1969. The historic mission that successfully delivered the first human beings to the surface of the moon. Now, despite the opinion of some that Space Oddity was a dig on the moon launch, the song was chosen by the BBC to be played during their TV coverage of Apollo 11. How about that?
1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff.
Apparently, Bowie had his own doubts about Space Oddity, playing as a theme song for the broadcast, worrying about a possible backlash if the mission failed or something went wrong. The BBC elected not to play the song until the Apollo 11 crew safely returned back to Earth. Fortunately, the mission was successful, and it was a triumphant homecoming for astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. Space Oddity was Bowie's first single to chart in the UK. It reached the top 5 on its initial release, and it received the 1970 Ivor Novello Special Award for Originality. Bowie's self-titled second album was renamed after the track for its 1972 re-release by RC Records and became commonly known as the Space Oddity LP. Space Oddity was also re-released in America in late 72, and it was David Bowie's breakthrough hit on US radio. It ascended to number 15 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1973. Coming up on 50 years here. Changes just missed cracking the Billboard Hot 100 in 72. It stalled at number 41. In 1975, upon re-release as part of a maxi single, Space Oddity became Bowie's first UK number 1 single.
You've really made the grade.
Cover versions of Bowie's Space Oddity have been recorded by a diverse list of artists. Sheryl Crow, Def Leppard.
This is ground control to Major Tom.
Tangerine Dream, and Captain Kirk William Shatner.
And the stars look very different today.
Great rendition there. In May 2013, Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield, commander of Expedition 35 to the International Space Station, recorded a version in space that went viral, dedicated to the genius of David Bowie.
This is Major Tom to ground control.
So let's put it in perspective here. Reflecting on circa 67 to 69 again, when the world was fascinated with space travel. The landmark sci-fi movie 2001: A Space Odyssey came out in theaters. A ton of space-obsessed literature was in bookstores, and the first human spacecraft, Apollo 8, took place in late '68, paving the way for the pinnacle achievement, Apollo 11, the first spacecraft to successfully land on the moon, and the first time that a human being walked on the moon. It was really such an exciting time in the world's history and an electrifying time for music. Space Oddity was at the forefront of the fervor of that time. Some labeled the tune a novelty, others a masterpiece. The track has ultimately become the latter. Even Tony Visconti had to admit that Gus Dudgeon's produced and Paul Buckmaster's arranged Space Oddity was an astounding accomplishment for the great David Bowie. In his own words, when Visconti heard the final version, he was gobsmacked. Of course, Visconti ended up collaborating with David Bowie on many of his greatest albums. You know, there was The Man Who Sold the World, Young American, Heroes, and Scary Monsters. Many of which we'll cover in the future, of course. Gus Dudgeon produced the seminal Elton John records, including Elton John's breakthrough self-titled LP and his opus, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Now, Gus was only 59 years old when he and his wife died in an auto accident in 2002. Paul Buckmaster was, of course, one of the most prolific music orchestrators of the rock era, conducting and arranging records by the Stones, the Grateful Dead, Harry Nilsson, Miles Davis, Stevie Nicks, Guns N' Roses, Kenny Rogers, and Taylor Swift, among many others. Sadly, Paul passed away just a few years ago, and the incomparable master of reinvention, the Thin White Duke, the Starman, Ziggy Stardust, the chameleon of rock. Has there ever been a rock star with more nicknames than this man? David Bowie left this earth in 2016 at the age of 69. One of the greatest losses the rock world has ever known. Space Oddity, definitely a high water mark of the rock and roll era.
This is Major Tom to ground control.
I gotta tell you, I remember when I heard it as a small child, it was shown to me by one of my family members who was a bit of an outcast, a punk rocker at that time. When I was a kid, hearing those haunting lyrics coming out of the speaker, that otherworldly alien voice of David Bowie. I was like a deer in the headlights of this rock and roll spaceship. I mean, Bowie was the H.G. Wells of rock and roll. We honor the vision, innovation, temerity, and trailblazing performance art of one of the all-time greatest rock and roll icons, whose timeless, force of nature composition Space Oddity, with its distinctive 7-part adventure, transported us to dimensions we wouldn't have known existed otherwise. Godspeed, King David. Forever mimicked, never equaled. Leave us a comment about this life-changing composition and on David Bowie. Tell us your favorite songs and albums by this genius. What are your memories of the days where he engages with this incredible gift? Please share in the comments below. If you like our content, we do invite you to be a permanent part of this community by subscribing below. Make sure to check us out on Patreon. We could use your support. Help us keep the music alive. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth. Talk to you soon.